A2, the Electoral College notes, functions and problems. Please make sure to add 3 pieces of information to each slide. If you don't get enough information from this, you can talk to one of your classmates or ask Mr. McDonald any questions you need. The Electoral College was actually created during the Constitutional Convention in a pretty, uncontroversial way. A couple of people were charged with the assignment of actually coming up with a way to elect the president, so they met privately in a local restaurant to come up with the idea. Of course, they didn't want the people, irrational as they were, to directly elect the president. What they wanted was some sort of buffer between the people and the actual president of the United States. So what they decided upon was this Electoral College, which was temporary in nature and would dissolve as soon as the election was over. So the direct election means a popular vote, or just to see how many people would win. So what they decided to do is have 51, well, now there's 51 mini elections. Then it was 13. There's 51 mini elections in the United States for president. Each state has its own election, and based on the winner in that state, Electoral College votes are added. So why do you think it's 51? Well, in the 1960s, Washington, D.C. became the 51st member of the establishment of the Electoral College when it was granted 3 Electoral College votes. Before, Washington, D.C. was a federal land and actually had no power in electing the president at all. You should watch this video. It's actually on the notes itself. You don't have time to create this. It's a really good explanation of how the Electoral College vote works. It's made by the same guy on YouTube that I follow who created the gerrymandering video. All right, so how the Electoral College works. So in November, there's a national election. People hold, that's the general election. That's what you and I vote in. And then after that, the electors, who are people who represent each state, go to their state capital and cast their votes for the president. The number of electors per state is determined by the number of seats in the House of Representatives plus the 2 Senate seats for that state. Iowa had 6 Electoral College votes in 2012 because we have 4 representative seats and 2 Senates. Now please remember, this is very important, representatives and senators are not members of the Electoral College. None of our senators, none of our representatives are allowed by the Constitution to act in the Electoral College. This is simply how we figure out how many electors are in the Electoral College for each state. So the number of the popular vote in a state wins all of the Electoral College votes within that state. So the general election for the presidency, the national ones, are held on Tuesday following the first Monday in November every 4 years. That's a little confusing, but that basically establishes that November 1st would never be an election. November 2nd could be, though. Doesn't matter if a candidate wins by 10, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million votes. The candidate who wins all of the votes for that state. In Nebraska and Maine, they've recently enacted legislation that breaks it up by district. This is a little bit more complicated. Let's use Iowa as if it ran with that same type of system. Again, as if it does that same election type of system, and we do not. But we know Iowa, so I'll discuss it this way. Iowa is split up into 4 House districts, 2 on the eastern side of the state, which are Democratic, and 2 on the western side of the state, which are Republican. If Nebraska and Maine's system were in place in Iowa, the 2 districts in the western Iowa would have been won by Romney, and the 2 districts in eastern Iowa would have been won by Obama. Under this system, Mitt Romney would have gotten 2 of the 6 Electoral College votes because of the 2 districts that he won. Obama would have gotten 4 Electoral College votes because he won 2 districts and he won the overall state popular vote, which gave him the 2 Senate Electoral College votes. Now that system is in place in Nebraska and Maine, but this is rapidly changing. There's some legislation currently in the spring or in the winter here of 2013 that is maybe could potentially add more states to this list. So the total number of Electoral College votes is 538. There's a really famous blogger, a predictor named Nate Silver, who has a blog called 538, okay, because of this. So how many to win? You need the majority, 270. So in modern times, 270, it's the race to 270 to see who is going to be the president of the United States. So who are the electors? Well, they're people chosen by the campaigns or by the parties. They're not particularly, they're not allowed to be people who have been elected into the or work for the federal government, but they're generally positions that are awarded to people for outstanding effort and help. So what happens is the Republicans in Iowa had 6 electors ready to go, and the Democrats in Iowa had 6 electors ready to go, for a total of 12 electors ready on Election Day to be nominated or to be elected into the Electoral College. However, only the winning electors do end up casting their vote. So the 6 Democratic electors in Iowa in this fall of 2012 were the winners. The electors meet the next month, the Monday after the second Wednesday in December, to cast their ballots. They met in Des Moines in Iowa. And then the next month after that, January 6th, the President of the Senate counts the Electoral College votes before a joint session of Congress. Of course, the President of the Senate is also the Vice President. Now, why are these so spread out? The question is, of course, the answer is because when the Constitution was created and when all of these traditions were started, we lived in, a 3-mile-an-hour world where people didn't, information couldn't travel very fast. So it took some time in order to get everything gathered up, to travel, and to actually be able to count their votes. Now, of course, in modern times, the night of election, we know who the winner is. So this is a map of 2000. 2008. The red states represent states that were the majority of the votes went to John McCain, the Republican in this case, in 2008, and the blue states were Barack Obama. You'll notice, though, that some of those states are big, but not very many people live in them. So the next map is going to be representative of the size of the Electoral College, based on the Electoral College. Okay, as you can see, the difference as we scroll back and forth between them, California gets nice and fat. The big sky states where the buffalo roam up there in Montana and Idaho and Colorado, North, South Dakota up here, shrink awful small. You can even see Washington, D.C. in the second. Can you see Washington, D.C. here? Nope. But with 3 Electoral College votes, it blows up to that size. So there's a few winners, or there's a few problems of the Electoral College. One of them is that not always do the winner of the popular vote win the presidency. And this happens for a few reasons. Number one, the winner takes all. Doesn't matter by how much or how little a candidate wins, they get all of the Electoral College votes. So if they could only win by 1, then they still get all the Electoral College votes. But if they win by millions and add to their popular vote, they still only get the same amount of Electoral College votes. Again, the 2 Senate seats do not correctly represent the population either. In Washington, D.C., they have between 500,000 and 600,000 people. Let's just call it 500,000 for this explanation. Washington, D.C. gets 3 Electoral College votes with 500,000 people. Iowa has 2.5 million people in it. Let's just call it that for this purposes as well. If it were proportional, for every 500,000 people, Iowa would get 3 Electoral College votes. With 2.5 million, how many would that make? 15 is the answer. If that were proportional, Iowa would have 15 Electoral College votes and Washington, D.C. would have 3. Obviously, Iowa has 6, not 15. So those 2 Senate states do not correctly represent the population. And of course, if you compared California to Washington, D.C., the disparity would be even larger. Or North Dakota. This has happened 4 times. Andrew Jackson versus John Q. Adams. There's actually 4 candidates running there, and none of them, including Andrew Jackson, had the had the majority, or 51% of the Electoral College votes. Jackson actually won the Electoral College votes and the popular vote, but what happened is the race went to the House of Representatives, and all of the states that had chosen the other two jumped on Adams's bandwagon and defeated Andrew Jackson. Rutherford B. Hayes and Sam Tilden. This was a very famous and influential presidential election, and a negative one, really. So Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican from the North. Samuel Tilden was a Democrat from the South. This happened about 12 years after the Civil War ended, 11 years after the Civil War ended. So in the 11 years after the Civil War, the North had basically militarily occupied the South to enforce voting rights and equal treatment of African Americans, or roughly equal treatment of African Americans. The South didn't like this. In the 1876 election, it was a virtual tie. It was a tie for the Electoral College, and it went to the House of Representatives. In a backroom meeting called the Compromise of 1877, Hayes won the presidency if the North would take the military out of the South. It did. Hayes became president, and African Americans became discriminated against. Jim Crow laws and other atrocities occurred for the next 90 years until the African Americans received, again, federal support from the government. It happened one more time with Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. In 2000, it didn't go to the it did not go to the House of Representatives. In fact, it went to the Supreme Court. So as you'll see, in 2000, Florida on the bottom right had 25 Electoral College votes, and it went to George Bush. It, however, went to George Bush on a very small margin. And there was a lot of sort of problems with the way that Florida had handled this. Florida, there was hanging chads, and there was a thing called the butterfly vote. If you remember from Scantrons that you take at Linn-Mar, there's X's down the middle of the two columns on the Scantrons, and it's difficult to tell if the X's mean that you got the question wrong on the left or on the right. Well, the same deal went with them voting, and there's a lot of problems with it. So the Democrats, after that night of the election, demanded a recount. Florida started considering to do it, and the Republicans then sued, and it went to the Supreme Court. And so the question before the Supreme Court was Bush. It was called Bush v. Gore, and in front of the Supreme Court, basically they said, does Florida have the right to redo the law and change their law and recount the vote after the election? And ultimately, the 5 conservatives appointed by Republicans said no, Florida does not have the right to vote, and the 5 or recount the vote, and the 5 liberals appointed by mostly appointed by Democrats said that they should. So there was no recount. Florida went to George W. Bush. Even in the case of a recount, Bush may have won. However, the Supreme Court had in effect decided the outcome or to end the process of the electoral battle. Then there's the issue of faithless electors. They don't have to vote for the candidate favored in their state. 25 states say that this is not allowed, that they have to vote exactly as the state does. It's happened a bunch of times, but only 10 or 12 times in modern time. In Minnesota, a funny example is a guy voted for the vice presidential candidate, John Edwards, for president. His name was Edwards. John Kerry was who he's supposed to vote for, but we're not sure if the the tough primary between John Edwards and John Kerry influenced that faithless elector. If the election goes to the House, or if nobody gets 270, which often occurs with 3 parties, it goes to the House. Each of the representatives in the state have to decide what to do, and the state as a whole gets 1 vote, regardless of how many representatives it has. It becomes a largely political battle, and this has happened 2 times in the United States history.